Callyn. I am the cooking school chef at our Harmons Holladay location. And today we are going to make my absolute favorite salad. This has actually become what we call our house salad in Holladay at our cooking school. It is a roasted Brussels sprout and kale salad. I think right now people are kind of looking for maybe somewhat of a little bit more of a healthier recipe. I love that this recipe can sit in your fridge for longer than a few days or for a few days. And it's really, really versatile. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, the base of this recipe is going to be our Brussels sprouts and our kale. And then everything else is really super versatile. So today I'm going to also add squash, tomatoes. Basil is going to go in our dressing, and then I am using a sheep and goat milk feta, which I love so much. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my squash. So you can buy these really awesome steamable vegetables in our produce department. So I've got our oven at about 400 degrees. I think also if you're doing big shops right now and you've got a lot of produce in your fridge, some that might be getting kind of on the older side, roasting your vegetables brings back so much life. And then instead of tossing them out, then you can go ahead and reuse them. So I like to roast at a really high heat. So here our ovens run pretty high, so I'm at about 400 degrees. At home, I know my oven runs a little low, so I roast at about 450. So really just depends on your oven. If you have convection, that also works great. So I have just a prepared sheet pan. So I have a piece of parchment paper on top, and that's just really going to help preserve my pan and for some even cooking here. So just going to go ahead and dump this out. Now with my nice clean hands right now, just going to spread these guys out. The most success, you're going to get the most success from roasting veggies if everybody has their own spot on the pan. So no one's overlapping. Everybody's got a little breathing room here. So I'm going to use our olive oil today. I like our Harmons fruity and peppery blend, but your preference is just fine. So I'm just going to do a little drizzle. There is going to be more olive oil in our recipe, so it doesn't need to be gobs. And then I am just going to sprinkle and season with a little sea salt. So you'll notice I'm salting from way up high, and that really helps to evenly distribute the salt. So again, we're going to kind of season as we go along. Season meaning adding salt to all of our vegetables and also to our salad. So I'm going to pop these babies in. I'm starting with my squash just because that butternut squash is a little bit more dense and is going to take just a little bit more time. And then I've got my other sheet pan here that I'm going to add my Brussels sprouts to. So you'll see that these are all kind of shaved. You can actually, at Harmons, you can buy already shaved Brussels sprouts. It's awesome. If I just need a quick salad, it makes it so simple. Or you can just go ahead and buy our single Brussels sprouts and give them a chop. So I'm just going to go ahead and chop them. You want these slices to be all about the same thickness. So if you're starting a little bit more thin, you want to continue with that thin slice instead of going a little bit thicker. Also, if you go a little bit thinner, the cook time will be quite a bit less. So these have already been washed and rinsed. So I'm just giving them a nice little chop here. So as I mentioned, we always add the Brussels sprouts and the kale to this salad. And then if you didn't want to go ahead with squash, you could do, you can also go with like a seasonal vegetable. So as we kind of get into summer squash season, that's super delicious in this recipe. So I know I mentioned before not to overlap. With Brussels sprouts, the little shavings can kind of overlap on top of each other, but the slices, you want those guys to have plenty of space on the pan. Okay. So that looks gorgeous, super beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and season this again with a little bit of olive oil and then a little more salt. Again, from up high. I'm going to mix this around just a little bit. Make sure everybody's got a little coating of olive oil on there. And then we're going to go ahead and pop these babies in too. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about my favorite ingredient, kale. So I prefer the curly kale for this recipe as opposed to like the dinosaur kale or a little bit more flat kale. I just find it really easy, really palatable. Yeah, so just preference. So when you get kale, you want to make sure to clean it really, really well. It can tend to get some residue that sits right down near the stem, so you just want to make sure and clean it really well. And then I just let it sit on a paper towel, just kind of wrap it up. But what I love about kale is that it can kind of take a little bit of a beating, so I'll say. So like if you're washing a spring greens, things can tend to get a little bit, unless you're using a salad spinner, tend to get a little bit soggy. But kale just really holds up to everything super, super well. So hold the kale stem by the very end, and then you're just going to pull in the opposite direction, and just to pull the stem straight out from the inside. So instead of going in and having to cut each one out, I can just go ahead and pull along here and pull the stem straight out. So it works super simple. So now I have this. I don't tend to use these stems. Even in a stock, they can be a little bit bitter. Sometimes if you chop them down, they can go in like a stew or something like that, but just know that they're going to be bitter and pretty fibrous. And then from here, another good technique with kale is that you want to chop it really nice and fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and, as you could see, I kind of bunched all the kale together, and then I'm just going to go ahead and give it a little bit of a chop. So now it's really nice and kind of spread out here, as opposed to these bigger leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and chop this all down. By cutting it a little bit thinner, it's going to make it way more palatable, and I think more people tend to enjoy it a little bit better. And also, whenever you're having any sort of a salad, you want to be able to just get a forkful instead of trying to stab a fork through a big leaf of lettuce here. So, all right. Again, just kind of tucking in and giving it a nice little bit of a chop. So those are all chopped up. Okay, now for the fun part. Okay, again with your nice clean hands. And I've been working all with vegetables, so there's been no cross-contamination. I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle a little salt. So when I say a pinch of salt, I really mean my 3 fingers as a pinch of salt. So it's really going to look more so like that instead of just this little bit of salt. So I'm just going to go ahead and salt over the top. And then I'm going to add about just a tablespoon right now of olive oil. So just give it a nice hearty drizzle. And then I'm literally going to give these babies a little massage. So starting at the top and just kind of working in the salt and olive oil. We're just going to keep massaging until we start to feel the kale go from this really hearty, pretty fibrous texture, and then in your hands, it literally you can start to feel the leaves kind of break down here. which is so great. And unlike its other leafy friends, kale holds up really, really well in the fridge, even after it's been seasoned and has some olive oil on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and call this great and beautiful. So as you can see, the color on the kale really kind of was brought to the surface and has a nice shine to all the leaves because it has olive oil and that little bit of salt on there. So I am gonna call that great and then work on the rest of my salad components. So I'm going to take a peek at my Brussels sprouts. I can start to smell them. They're getting a little bit of brown around the edges, and that's absolute preference as far as how long you want your Brussels sprouts to go. I would say if you're making this for a family with younger kids, you might want those to go a little bit longer. I find that really roasted veggies kids really, really love because they kind of get that nice caramelization on there and are a little bit tastier. So I am going to go ahead and add just my whole packet of basil. So just kind of stacking these all together, all my leaves. So this really ends up to be, it's a part of the salad, but it's really adds to the dressing. But this dressing is super simple, minimal ingredients. So just going to give this a little bit of a chop. Whenever you're working with fresh, especially leafy herbs, the less you chop, the better. Otherwise, you can just tend to bruise them. So if I were to go back and chop this again, the chances of me going all the way through and not just bruising are pretty minimal. So I just want to go ahead and let these have just a nice chop. So that's just going to go right in my salad. It smells like summer. So then I'm going to go ahead and add some tomatoes. You can leave these whole. I'm just going to chop some of these in half. Again, this is just another addition. Tomato isn't something that I necessarily put in all the time. If I'm having this salad in the dead of winter, I might not pick tomatoes. I might just stick to squash or a caramelized onion, more root vegetables, that sort of thing. Even potatoes are super tasty in here. And then as I mentioned before, using a grain is really, really nice. Adds just a little more protein, a little more sustainable. So I think it can just kind of work with the seasons. So that looks pretty good to me. Okay. And then since our veggies are still going, I'm going to go ahead and add our cheese to this. So this recipe can absolutely be vegan and gluten-free. In our dressing, we're going to be using a tamari, which is a gluten-free version of soy sauce. Otherwise, you can just use soy sauce. And then you can omit the cheese if you want it to be vegan as well. So I'm from Wisconsin, so I happen to put in cheese in just about every recipe. But I like to keep things heavy on the vegetables. So I'm just going to go ahead and crumble this right over the top. And then you can always add this to each bowl or plate individually, but we'll just start with that much for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and check on my Brussels sprouts. I can smell them. They smell so tasty. So I'm going to actually call this good because I like these a little bit more crunchy. But you can start to see some of the Brussels sprouts are starting to kind of caramelize and get brown on the sides. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add that in. Yum. All right. Super tasty. And then I'll show you how our squash is starting to look really, really nice. I'm going to just kind of pierce it and see how they're cooking. They're still a little bit firm, If you wanted these to go even faster, you could cut them a little bit smaller, but I'm gonna pop these babies in a little bit longer. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and give this a little toss. And then those hot Brussels sprouts start to kind of melt the cheese, which is kind of nice, just kind of warms it up. So then from here, I'm gonna add, we're probably good on olive oil. If it looks a little bit dry, you can go ahead and add a little bit more. And then my ratio is really like a 1/4 cup of olive oil altogether as far as what we put on our olive oil, or excuse me, on our vegetables and in our salad, to about 2 tablespoons of balsamic and about a tablespoon of soy sauce or tamari. So I'm just gonna go ahead and give a little sprinkle. As I mentioned, a couple tablespoons, and then about a tablespoon of soy sauce. So the tamari or soy sauce is really salty, and we've already salted everything, so this just kind of enhances that salty flavor. Doesn't need to be gobs. I just think it really brings out that nice saltiness. And then we of course want to do a nice crack of fresh pepper. Give this a mix. And let's add our squash. Oof, yum. Okay. I also like to kind of try and add lots of color to this. So I thought that the squash would be really beautiful today. It's kind of a drizzly day out, so we'll add some brightness. Give this a mix. And then, as I mentioned before, if I wanted to do a fried egg on this, I could do that, or I could just eat this as is. I'm a big fan of a big salad bowl, so I'm just gonna go ahead and serve this up. You want a little bit of all the vegetables in here. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add a little more cheese because that's delicious. And then there, my friends, is our holiday house salad up in our cooking school. Again, this sits really well in your fridge for a few days, or right now it's kind of has this really nice balance of cold and hot right now. So if you would like this recipe, you can head on over to harmonsgrocery.com. We also have, along with this recipe, lots more and some videos on YouTube. So come check us out. Thanks for watching.